Did you ever get blamed for something you didn't do, just because you were easy to blame?
I came back expecting the kind of awkward hugs people give when they do not know what to do with a uniformed daughter who has been gone too long, expecting leftover casseroles and the soft kind of silence that follows hard months. And instead, I walked into a living room where my husband had my brother on speaker, my parents sat in their church faces like they were about to vote on my life, and everyone had clearly rehearsed a version of events in which I was grateful for the mess they had made. Because apparently it was all in the name of keeping things stable while I was gone, which tells you exactly how little they thought of me and how much they counted on me being too tired to ask questions. I did not ask questions at first because the paperwork was already laid out like a menu, and I read fast when I am angry, so I saw the so-called investment agreement with my brother's little rental scheme. The transfer out of what used to be our savings into a new account with his initials dressed up as a company. The refinance inquiry I never authorized, the signature that looked enough like mine if you had never met me, and a bill of sale for my truck that had been in my name since before the marriage, which they called a necessary sacrifice to cover a temporary cash crunch, and when I looked at my husband he said I would understand once I had slept. And when I looked at my parents, my mother said families do what they have to do, and my father said it was all legal because my brother knew a notary, and that is when my ears started ringing in the way that tells me I am not going to cry, I am going to focus. There is a particular tone people take with women who serve, as if the discipline and the backbone get checked at the door of the house, as if you can wear responsibility like a coat that comes off when your family decides it is inconvenient. And hearing my own parents try to fold my anger into some speech about unity made something very simple settle in me, because unity without respect is just a group project where you carry everybody else's grade, and I have done enough of that for one lifetime. My husband said we could rebuild together if I would stop overreacting, that my brother had only stepped in because he was family and men take care of things while women are away. And my brother's voice came through the speaker with that friendly half-laugh he uses when he is lying, telling me I would get a cut of the profits on the rental if I just let the transfer sit for a few months, and my mother nodded along like an usher. And somewhere in the middle of that little performance I realized they were not asking for forgiveness or even permission, they were asking for my quiet cooperation so they could keep standing on my spine. I did what I always do when someone tries to talk me into believing the ground is not under my feet. I went to work, and it was not dramatic, not loud, not even visible to them right away. Because the best moves are the ones they do not feel until it is too late. So I took my wallet and my orders and I drove to the bank where the manager knew me from high school, and I sat down with my military ID and the copy of the power of attorney I had signed before deployment, and I revoked it in writing. And I filed a fraud dispute on every transfer connected to the Shell account, and I opened a new account in my name only with two-factor authentication on a number none of them have, and I moved my remaining pay and the housing stipend the moment it hit. And then I called the mortgage servicer and put a verbal password on the loan, and I canceled every card where my husband was an authorized user, and I froze my credit with all three bureaus while I waited in the parking lot for confirmation. Emails that felt like oxygen after a long hold underwater. When the manager asked if I wanted to press charges, I told her I wanted a clean paper trail, because the thing about people who sell your truck and call it love is that they count on you to blow up, to make yourself the story. And I am done being the story they used to hide their own choices, so I went home, and I did not raise my voice, I did not explain, I did not ask. I just took the file folders I had kept in a locked bin in the closet. The ones with the title to the house in my maiden name. From before the wedding, the pay stubs, the email prints, the screenshots, and I put them in a plain grocery bag beside the door like it was just some errand I would run later. And when my mother started another unity speech, I told her I would bring dessert to dinner tomorrow, and she relaxed because she heard surrender, which is exactly what I wanted her to hear. Back in the kitchen, I wrote one line on a sticky note and slid it under the silverware tray, so the first time my husband went looking for something easy, he would have to touch the fact that nothing about this would be easy anymore. And it said simply that all access had been revoked and any further use of my name would meet a lawyer before it met me, and then I set an appointment with Legal on Base, forwarded copies of the bank confirmations to a private email he does not know exists, and packed a small box with a few things that actually matter to me, which is not much once you strip away the story other people tell about you. The group text for the family dinner came in before midnight with my mother's cheerful promise that we would get past all this, because that is what families do, and I typed that I would be there right on time and that I would bring something everyone could share. And I hit send with a calm I had not felt since I opened the door that afternoon, because by the time we sit down at that table, the person they thought they could manage will be gone and the woman who replaced her will be holding the receipts. I showed up at that family dinner exactly on time, carrying a plain box of pastries from the grocery store bakery, nothing fancy and nothing homemade, because I wanted to see how quickly my mother would interpret the choice as some kind of olive branch. And I was not disappointed when she smiled a little too wide and said she was glad to see I was already softening, which made my father clear his throat and begin one of his long monologues about how people only survive if they hold each other up in hard times, and how forgiveness is the only way forward, and how my brother and my husband had only done what they thought was necessary because men are wired to protect, which would have been almost funny if it were not so pathetic. Because what exactly were they protecting me from? Independence, autonomy, or the simple fact that I had earned a life without them pulling the strings? The table was crowded but felt empty at the same time, because I was surrounded by people whose words did not line up with their actions, and every fork scrape against a plate sounded like a reminder that I was expected to sit there, too quietly, and accept whatever scraps of dignity they thought I still had. And when my brother leaned back in his chair with that smug half-smile that used to get him out of speeding tickets, I could practically hear the unspoken line he wanted me to swallow. That I was lucky to be included, that family meant overlooking personal harm so that the bigger picture could remain intact, that I was supposed to see betrayal as a rough patch instead of a permanent fracture. When my husband finally spoke, it was to tell me in a voice carefully pitched to sound reasonable that couples go through worse and make it out stronger, that he had already looked at counseling options, that he was willing to forgive my anger if I could find it in me to move forward, and my mother chimed in with the kind of syrupy tone she saves for church potlucks when she wants to signal to the congregation that everything is fine at home, saying that one day I would look back and realize this was just a test, and that God never gives us more than we can handle, and I wanted to laugh right in her face because the only test happening was whether I would let them keep writing the script for my life while I played the role of the obedient daughter and wife. I let them keep talking, nodding in the right places, chewing slowly, letting the silence stretch in ways that made them nervous, because silence is its own kind of weapon when people expect an explosion. And I could feel my father shift uncomfortably when I did not immediately agree that reconciliation was the only logical path, and I could feel my brother start drumming his fingers on the table when I asked, without raising my voice, whether he intended to return the truck he had sold behind my back, or at least cut me in on the profits of his little real estate venture, since it was apparently a family enterprise now, and the way his jaw tightened told me the question had landed exactly where I wanted it to. By the end of the meal, my mother had wrapped her arm around my shoulders like we were already in the middle of a reunion montage, and my husband had started outlining his big plan for how we would build equity again. And my father was offering to pray over us all, but I kept my eyes on my plate and thought about how strange it was that the people who had gutted me from the inside were so desperate to control the optics of togetherness, because it was never about healing or making amends. It was always about maintaining the appearance of a strong, united family so they could hold their heads up in front of neighbors and colleagues. When dessert was served, I quietly excused myself to the bathroom, pulled out my phone, and sent 3 short emails that would change the balance of power more than any raised voice ever could. One to the attorney confirming my appointment for the following week, one to a friend in town who owed me a favor in the housing department, and one to myself with attached photos of every document I had already pulled from the closet. When I slipped the phone back into my pocket, I caught my reflection in the mirror and saw not a woman breaking down but a woman gearing up, and I realized that letting them think I was bending was the smartest move I could make. Because the more convinced they were that I was on the verge of caving, the less prepared they would be when I finally stopped playing. As I came back to the table, My father was finishing another speech about how important it was to move past mistakes before they hardened into resentment, and I smiled just enough to make him think he was getting through. While in my head, I was already drawing up the order of operations for everything that would come next, and I knew without a shred of doubt that the unity they kept preaching was nothing more than a muzzle they wanted me to wear, and that the only real path forward was the one where I cut the leash entirely and left them standing in the echo of their own empty words. And as I gathered my coat from the back of the chair, thanking my mother for the meal with just enough sweetness to convince her she had won the night, I thought about the appointment I had already set in stone, the paperwork that was already waiting, and the way their faces would look when they realized that the quiet woman they thought they had manipulated into silence was already 5 steps ahead of them, and for the first time since I walked back into this so-called home, I felt the beginnings of control settling back in my chest. The morning after that carefully staged dinner, when my mother's voice still echoed in my ears with her practiced lines about forgiveness, and when my husband's fake calm still played back in my mind like a broken record, I woke up with the clearest sense that nothing they had said was meant to heal me or even acknowledge the damage they had done, but rather to position me as the weak link they could corral back into the fold before neighbors or coworkers noticed cracks in the family portrait. And once I saw it for what it was, I could no longer waste energy debating with them about morality or loyalty, because what I needed now was not another emotional plea or confrontation, but a structure, a strategy, and a sequence of moves that would leave them exposed before they ever realized I had stopped playing their game. I sat down at my small desk, pulled out a yellow pad, and started writing in long, deliberate lines every asset, every account, every shared obligation, and every contact they had tried to touch or control. Because if there is one thing the military teaches you, it is that you never go into a mission without knowing the terrain, and as I mapped it out I realized that for years I had allowed myself to be the silent workhorse who filed documents, balanced payments, and maintained routines that nobody else paid attention to, which meant that now I held an invisible key to almost every door they thought was locked in their favor. And the knowledge that this power was mine alone was the first time in weeks I felt a kind of exhilaration that almost resembled relief. I began with the financial layer because money was the bloodstream of every excuse they had given me, the justification for betrayal disguised as necessity, and I knew that if I could cut off the circulation, the rest of their body would begin to collapse. So I reached out to the fraud department again and requested full copies of the disputed transactions, not just the summaries, because I wanted the printouts with timestamps and routing numbers, the kind of evidence that could not be spun into a misunderstanding, and I stored them neatly in a private folder on a drive only I controlled, one that I encrypted and backed up offsite, because I was not going to risk them suddenly losing paperwork the way my brother had a habit of losing receipts for anything that might expose him. While that was moving in the background, I turned to the social layer, because in a family like mine, reputation was currency almost as powerful as money, and if you can shake the certainty people have about their standing in the community, you weaken them in ways no lawsuit ever could. So I made a few carefully timed phone calls to acquaintances I knew would not keep secrets long, people who thrived on half-truths and speculation, and I fed them just enough detail to set rumors in motion, not wild accusations, but small undeniable facts like the timing of the truck sale, or the overlap between my brother's supposed business expansion and the disappearance of funds from my household account. And then I sat back and trusted human nature to do the rest, because gossip is an organism that feeds on its own momentum. It was not long before the phone started buzzing with messages from cousins and old neighbors asking if everything was all right, phrased in that nosy yet cautious tone that tells you the story has already spread beyond your control, which was exactly the point. Because once the circle began to whisper, my parents could no longer stand in front of their church group and declare proudly that we were united without somebody raising an eyebrow, and my brother could no longer walk into a local diner without wondering who had heard what, and my husband could no longer assume that his version of events would remain the only one anyone believed, because I had planted the seeds that made doubt bloom in places they could not reach to trim it back. The most satisfying part was how ordinary my actions looked from the outside. I went to work, I kept my appointments, I answered the occasional call from my mother with a polite hum. And I even sent a recipe link to my sister-in-law as if everything was back to normal, because what they did not see was that every smile and every nod was another layer of camouflage covering the fact that I had already moved half my accounts, locked down my credit, begun drafting a legal timeline with my attorney, and opened up communication with an old friend who knew more about contracts and corporate registrations than my brother would ever imagine. By the time my parents called another family gathering to try again at pushing reconciliation, I was no longer nervous or uncertain about what to say, because I knew the truth was not only on my side, but also quietly dripping into the ears of everyone they cared about impressing, and the balance had begun to tilt, not with a dramatic explosion, but with a slow and steady shift of leverage. And all I had to do was walk into their dining room with my folder of documents and my calm face, knowing they were already halfway undone without me ever raising my voice, and the thought of their expressions when I finally pulled the curtain back was the only fuel I needed to keep the mask of compliance firmly in place. And as I folded the yellow pad and tucked it into the folder, I realized that revenge was not going to be one grand gesture, but a collection of precise cuts, each one clean, each one undeniable, and each one leaving them a little more exposed than before. And with that realization came the calm certainty that the woman they thought they had broken had never been more dangerous, because I had nothing left to lose except the illusions they had built, and stripping those away was going to be more satisfying than any apology they could have offered. The night of that so-called family gathering arrived, and while my parents no doubt believed they were orchestrating another polite intervention filled with rehearsed speeches about blood ties and second chances, I walked through their front door with a folder under my arm, a calm expression that I had practiced in the mirror, and the quiet knowledge that every word I spoke and every piece of paper I revealed would be far more powerful than any raised voice, because facts cannot be debated in the same way emotions can, and I was finally ready to stop letting them gaslight me into silence. They had set the table as if we were attending some holiday feast, my mother placing her best china and my father sitting at the head like a judge about to preside over a case he had already decided, while my brother smirked with the kind of confidence that only comes from someone who thinks he has allies at every angle, and my husband sat across from me wearing that forced look of patient endurance, the expression of a man pretending to be the victim of his wife's stubbornness rather than the architect of betrayal. But beneath their staged composure I could feel the unease, the slight hesitation in their greetings, because the rumors I had seeded had already reached them, and they were suddenly aware that I might not be as passive as they had hoped. My father cleared his throat and launched into a lecture about resilience, about how every family faces storms and that our ability to come through them together defined who we were. And my mother nodded along with tears in her eyes as if the emotional performance might soften me, and my husband leaned forward with his hands folded in a pose that screamed of rehearsed humility, claiming he had made mistakes, but was willing to rebuild if only I would stop letting anger cloud my judgment, and my brother chuckled nervously while insisting the whole situation with the accounts was nothing but a temporary arrangement that had simply been misunderstood, but I let them all speak without interruption, because the silence that followed was the stage I had been preparing for. When the room finally grew quiet, I placed the folder on the table, opened it carefully, and spread out the documents I had collected, the bank statements showing the unauthorized transfers, the vehicle title with the forged signature, the notarized dispute forms, and the screenshots of messages between my husband and my brother discussing how best to keep me calm until everything was settled. And as their eyes darted across the papers, I watched the shift happen in real time, the smirk slipping from my brother's face, the faux patience draining from my husband's posture, the color rising in my mother's cheeks, and the stiffening of my father's jaw as he realized there was no speech, no prayer, and no well-placed guilt trip that could erase the black and white evidence staring back at them. I spoke evenly, not with anger but with certainty, explaining that I had already revoked every authorization, locked down my credit, secured my income, and placed legal holds on any further attempts to use my name. And I added that if they chose to challenge me, The next people to see these documents would not be neighbors or cousins, but law enforcement and civil courts, and the silence that followed was deafening, because they had spent weeks assuming I was still the same woman who had bent to keep peace, when in reality I had already dismantled the very foundation of their manipulation piece by piece. My mother tried to recover first, dabbing her eyes and saying that this was unnecessary, that dragging dirty laundry into the open would destroy us all. But I looked her directly in the eye and told her that she had destroyed us the moment she chose to protect appearances instead of her daughter, and my brother shifted uncomfortably in his chair, muttering that this was not as serious as I was making it, until I slid a copy of the forged bill of sale across the table and asked him whether he would prefer to explain the signature discrepancy to me now or to the police later, and the way he avoided my gaze told me I had landed exactly where it hurt. My husband, still clinging to the idea that charm could carry him through, reached for my hand and tried to spin a story about rebuilding, about how couples who endure hardships become stronger in the long run, but I pulled my hand back slowly, pointed to the printed text of his own words where he referred to me as an obstacle, and asked him to explain how a man who sees his wife as a liability could possibly be trusted to rebuild anything, and for once in his life he had nothing to say, which was more satisfying than any dramatic outburst could have been. I did not yell, I did not curse, and I did not cry, because the documents spoke louder than any performance ever could, and when I stood to leave, gathering the folder and sliding it neatly back under my arm, I told them that this was not the end of the matter, but only the beginning, because I had no intention of reconciling, forgiving, or erasing what they had done, and the look on their faces, a mix of shock, fear, and dawning realization that their control was slipping away, was all the proof I needed that exposure was the only language they truly understood. The next morning, before the coffee had even finished brewing, my phone rang with my mother's number flashing across the screen, and when I answered, she did not even bother with pleasantries, launching instead into a desperate plea that I return to the house, that I sit down again, that we find a way to repair this for the sake of family unity. And as she spoke, I felt the corners of my mouth tighten into something that was not quite a smile, because in that moment I knew that they were no longer trying to protect me or even themselves. They were scrambling to protect the image they had built, and that image was already crumbling whether I returned to the table or not. By the time the last confrontation came, I had already stripped away every illusion they thought they could maintain, because the financial leverage was gone. The social whispers were spreading faster than they could chase them down, and the carefully constructed mask of unity that my parents clung to so tightly had been cracked wide open by their own hypocrisy. But instead of acknowledging defeat, or even showing the humility of people who know they crossed a line too far, they doubled down in the only way people like them know how, with endless appeals to blood ties, tradition, and obligations that only ever seemed to flow one direction. And when I sat in their living room one final time, it was not to negotiate or to forgive, but to end the game completely. My mother started first, her voice pitched with that shrill edge of desperation that makes every word sound less like an invitation and more like a demand, telling me that the community was talking, that people were asking questions, that I was jeopardizing the family's reputation by refusing to reconcile, and when she said the word reconcile, she meant it in the most hollow way possible, because she did not care about healing or truth or even fairness. She cared about appearances. About whether she could still hold her head high in church or at the grocery store, and I could see in her eyes that the betrayal itself mattered less to her than the fact that I refused to quietly absorb it. My father followed, delivering yet another sermon about unity and forgiveness, using words like legacy and heritage, trying to make me feel that walking away was somehow an abandonment of everything they had built. But all I could think about was how that legacy had been written on the back of my sacrifices, my labor, my loyalty, and my silence, and now that I had taken those things away, suddenly the entire structure looked less like a family and more like a house of cards that collapsed. The moment I refused to hold up the weight. My husband tried next, and even then he still believed charm could salvage the wreckage, sitting forward with that pleading tone, insisting that the affair with my brother had been a mistake born of loneliness and bad judgment. claiming that he had already cut ties with him, promising that if I would just come back home we could rebuild. And when I looked at him I saw not a partner or even a man begging forgiveness, but an opportunist who could not stomach the thought of losing the stability my presence provided, because to him I had never been a wife so much as an insurance policy against the consequences of his own failures. And then there was my brother, who had been quieter than usual until that moment, when he leaned in with false bravado and told me I was blowing everything out of proportion, that business deals sometimes blurred with personal matters. That family loyalty meant looking past mistakes because otherwise none of us would survive, and I could barely contain my disgust as I listened to him attempt to frame betrayal as a minor misstep, because what he wanted was not reconciliation but amnesty. A free pass to keep living as if his choices had no weight, as if his greed and arrogance could be washed clean just because our parents were too weak to call it what it was. I let them all speak. I let their words pile up in the air like smoke from a fire that had already burned itself out, and when the silence finally came, the kind of silence that feels heavy and expectant, I took a slow breath and told them in clear, steady words that I had heard every plea, every excuse, every justification, and that I was done pretending any of it mattered, because what they were asking was not reconciliation but surrender, and I was finished surrendering pieces of myself too. People who had already proven they would use every inch I gave them as leverage against me. My mother began to cry. My father pressed his lips together in disapproval. My husband whispered my name as if that might soften me, and my brother rolled his eyes like a child caught in a lie, but I stood and looked at them all one by one, letting the silence linger until they were forced to meet my gaze, and then I said the only words that truly mattered, the words that had been building in me since the first moment I saw the forged papers and the smirk on my brother's face, the words that cut deeper than any accusation or threat could. What family? The moment hung in the air, sharp and irreversible, and I saw the exact second my parents realized there was no prayer, no dinner, no staged reconciliation that could erase the damage. And I saw the fear in my husband's eyes as he understood that his safety net had been cut away, and I saw the flicker of panic in my brother's expression when he realized I was not bluffing, that I would rather stand alone with my integrity intact than bend to their manufactured version of unity, and in that instant I felt lighter than I had in years, because the chains of obligation and guilt that they had wrapped around me were gone, shattered by one clean break. When I walked out of that house, I did not slam the door or raise my voice, because there was no need for dramatics. The damage was already done, the balance already shifted, and the image they cared about more than me was already unraveling in the eyes of the world. And as I stepped into the quiet night, I knew that for the first time since this nightmare began, I was not the one left broken. They were, because the daughter, the wife, the sister they thought they could manipulate into silence, had shown them that silence could turn into strategy, strategy into exposure, and exposure into the final word that left them powerless. And so when people ask me now whether I regret not reconciling, whether I wish I had chosen unity over division, I simply tell them that unity without respect is slavery dressed up as tradition, and that I chose freedom instead. Because once you see betrayal for what it is, you can never unsee it, and once you understand that blood does not excuse cruelty, you can never go back. And while my parents may continue to call themselves a family, I no longer answer to that word. Because the family I had is gone, and in its place stands the life I will build on my own terms, with no apologies, no compromises, and no illusions left to protect.